For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute for the Sustainability of Democracy in Africa joins me in studio to discuss 2011's emerging political trends and what this sets in motion for the decade. Welcome, Ebrahim.
Thanks.
Do you think there was democratic progress or reversal on the continent in 2011?
Sharon, I think the evidence is quite mixed. Zambia had an election, one which wasn't terribly violent or at all, no real social conflict emerging. And in fact, interestingly, they had a turnover of power. That means a different president. So, I think that's one indicator of some kind of democratic progress, some kind of acceptance that elections is the way in which citizens will come together and a society will elect leaders. And they managed to find a stable and relatively peaceful turnover of power. Of course, it was a contested election, but any election is going to be contested heavily because that's the nature of it. South Africa had its third local government elections, without much incident. Of course, a credible and legitimate result, which was, as is the case in Zambia, even though they had a turnover of power, and the usual trend in the continent is those have been contested. So I think we've got two good indicators there. You had a referendum in 2011 in Sudan, and South Sudan was declared as the newest state in Africa. So again, an entrenchment of a process by which citizens come together and express their preferences for leadership. But there were also signs of reversal. And unfortunately in the DRC, which you had a very contested election, which gave rise to massive amounts of social conflict and violence, someone clinging onto power who by all accounts appears not to have won that election and should not have won that election, but the result appears to suggest that he did. And that result is contested, it's in question, and it's surprising that many of the observers who were there, many of those observer missions in fact said that election was not free, that election was not credible, and that election was not fair. And yet the African Union and to a degree the South African Development Community, SADC observers, did in fact say that election was credible. So, unfortunately on the continent there are signs of democratic progress and, as I've just pointed out, signs of democratic reversal. There are also, interestingly, I think, some hope for progress. And that hope for progress emerges, I think, in two different poles. One in Southern Africa in Zimbabwe and another in East Africa in Kenya. So Kenya is going through a process of writing a new constitution, constructing new laws, constructing a new governance system. And there, lots of civic participation, a government of national unity, which though has its serious problems, is managing to be fairly stable. Unfortunately, that's not the case in Zimbabwe, where you also have a government of national unity, but very little consensus on many of the major issues which are required to ensure that there's stable governance and better development, at least rehabilitation of the existing infrastructure in that country. There's also serious internal political contestation going on in all the different political parties in Zimbabwe. And though that's necessary, and I think is a natural part of politics, unfortunately this has taken on such a flavor that it's affecting the way in which the partners in the government of national unity can construct a cohesive and coherent program for governance. So, there is both signs of democratic progress and signs of democratic reversal. That's at the state level. If we think about citizens, I think that we've got a very clear indication happening across the world, in fact, not just on the continent, that citizens are taking power back to themselves. This happened in North Africa, where you've had changes, massive changes. Tunisia had an election, so another sign of democratic progress. Egypt is in the process of having an election, but we know that Egypt, unfortunately, is not stable. Egypt, unfortunately, is racked by deep levels of social conflict at the moment. There's people wanting all sorts of different things, and the electoral process that they've embarked on is a very complicated and complex one, going through different phases. They're in the middle, I think, of the phase of the legislative elections, which will end quite soon, and then they will have a presidential election in June. So, lots of elections taking place, but lots of citizens showing that they want to take power back to themselves. And so in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, and even though Libya is a special case, we do find that people have come out to say that this is not working for us. We want something different. But that's also true in countries like Uganda, where they had a massive stay away and a boycott of buses, where people started walking to work every day. Same is true in Kenya, where people regularly take to the streets. And in South Africa, we know for the past decade that literally in community protests, whether it be over service delivery or some other issue, people have literally taken to the streets every week or every 2 weeks. Some other communities out there. But this is not just a phenomenon restricted to the continent. This is happening globally. You had the Occupy movements emerging elsewhere, and probably for the first time in London, they've had to recenter the question of race relations, where young black Londoners were out on the streets saying, this system is not working for us and it's simply not accommodating us. And then, of course, you've got massive crises in the economy in some of the European countries where citizens have been out on the streets for close on to 5 years now. So this movement of citizens taking power back to themselves, if we're thinking of democracy as participation, of people expressing themselves, then, of course, there's a lot of that going on. But in terms of democratic governance, I think we've had both progress and reversal. And South Africa, Zimbabwe show us good signs of progress. Egypt to a degree, Tunisia, yes, but serious signs of reversals emerging in countries like the DRC, where some people would claim there was in fact simply a stolen election.
Now, speaking of governance, where do you think the key challenges lie?
Well, I think the state building and the question of how states function, whether they have the efficiencies, the effectiveness, and in fact the policies, the rightly crafted policies, whether they're inclusive and whether those governments actually allow their parliaments to fulfill the role and the function that they ought to. One of the very strong weaknesses is we've got very weak parliaments across the continent. And those parliaments are weak both on their legislative and policy making agendas, but are even weaker when it comes to the question of oversight. And when we talk about oversight, it's their parliament's ability to hold on behalf of society the executive leaders accountable. So in some cases you even have presidents who act as monarchs, literally as untouchable kings and queens, who can't be asked questions, who are not accountable for the kind of decisions they make, and who are not accountable for the way in which their governments perform. I think that's the most serious challenge. And it most acutely is expressed in the way in which the newest African state has been declared. And that's the question of South Sudan, where you've had this new state, and there was lots of joyous celebration that this new state is now declared itself. But that state was obviously going to be faced with the serious challenges of building the state from the ground, building the economy from the ground. So putting in place institutions, structures and processes, and that takes a long time. But before they could even get that, there was a whole range of social challenges which emerged, and these are also serious governance questions. So if people thought that the declaration of this new state, where there was deep conflict, intractable some might say, between what was conceived as a Muslim North and a Christian South, which wasn't, and I think that was an inaccurate characterization. But anyway, they thought that once this new state will be declared, you'll get rid of some of those problems. And guess what? There's deep levels of social conflict which have emerged on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of tribe and clan affiliation, which clan would get access to which kind of resources, because there's a lot of development resources which are being put in by donors and international aid agencies to help build the state and to build society and to build the economy, which had to be done from scratch. And you've got deep levels of social conflict before any of this can start to take root. So you've got leaders, whether of these clans, tribes, ethnicities, or whatever basis on which they come together to form an interest group, are not showing responsibility for the way in which the society as a whole, in the common interest, has to find stability in order for development to take some root. And of course, this is also giving rise to, I think, a big theme of something which has been on the continent for a long time, and this is conflict between ideas of tradition and ideas of modernity. They very much want to be part of the modern world and the modern era, but want to retain certain elements of tradition. Now that may well be possible to coexist, but one has to find ways in which they coexist, and unfortunately on the continent we haven't been doing so. What overall this has actually given rise to is, and I think this is also thematic across the continent, is this conflict between popular sovereignty and national sovereignty. So when we talk about national sovereignty, we're talking about societies who believe that they ought to be able to protect themselves as states, as governments, and as societies from interference from outside. Now, in Zimbabwe, that's what Robert Mugabe claims he's trying to do, is protecting the national sovereignty from outside interference. And that is a very good, legitimate, credible aim. Of course, that's what the whole independence, liberation, anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggle was about. However, it is undermining popular sovereignty. That is the ability of ordinary citizens to be able to politically express what their wishes and desires are and then form a government on that basis. So while it's a legitimate, credible, and I think ethical, moral, political agenda to have a protection of national sovereignty, I think leaders on the African continent have to get more realistic. That if they want stable governance, better governance, then they will have to allow a greater degree of popular sovereignty, which will in fact automatically translate into a body of citizens wanting to protect the national sovereignty on their own. Now, of course, in a country like Libya, something completely different happened. What happened was that there was this uprising of popular sovereignty. And again, some might argue whether this was in fact popular sovereignty, because some people say, well, if ordinary citizens decided that they're taking to the streets, how come they were so well armed so quickly? And suddenly you found that NATO had decided to intervene in this country to find some kind of resolution, because there was this deep, intractable conflict. And what happened was that the national sovereignty and in fact the popular sovereignty was completely undermined. So what in fact did happen, they would argue, is that societies and countries whose own societies and economies are in decline are having to find ways in which they can assert their authority, their profile, their legitimacy, build their economies, and they're doing it in ways in which there is a now new imperialism beginning to emerge on the continent. And this is true, I think, unfolding before our very eyes in Egypt, where there are people in Tahrir Square who are out protesting literally every day, wanting a modern secular government. There are people in the towns and villages of Egypt, which in fact is the majority of the population, wanting a different kind of governance. And of course, there's the military who is currently in power. They claim ushering over a transition. But the interest of the Americans to have the military continue to govern is unstated, but nevertheless desirous for them, simply because that military is the second largest recipient of United States government aid after Israel. And of course, Egypt is a very strategic post. It's control of the Suez Canal, and it's literally on the border of Israel. And so it's in their interest to ensure that they have, the Americans' interest to ensure that they have a government who is going to be sympathetic to what they believe are going to be their own aims and their own goals. So, you know, I think Egypt is going to show us, unfolding before our eyes, how this deep conflict between popular sovereignty and national sovereignty is playing itself out. So I think that there have been this five major trends which have emerged in this decade, or in the beginning of this decade. The first is that, you know, on the continent we've got some hope, some signs of democratic progress, and hopefully that can take root both in terms of democratic governance, but also in terms of citizen participation. So you've had elections, they were regular, they were held on time. There was even in some cases a turnover of power, which is very, very stable. And others which were contested and gave rise to deep social conflict. Also had the rise of emergent citizen power, citizens taking power back to themselves. This conflict between national sovereignty and popular sovereignty. And I think one of the big challenges is economic development, the development of the economy, and that's being affected, of course, obviously, not just by an inability to rapidly modernize and stimulate economic development on the continent, whether it be through trade or whether it be through industry, manufacturing, but also because of the global economic recession and the decline in Europe.
Now, on that note, do you think the global economic crisis will affect party politics in South Africa during 2012? And do you think it will cause a growth in opposition parties?
Well, I think that if we're talking about South Africa particularly, you know, the prospect of growth in opposition parties is neither here nor there, because they've shown over several elections that their potential for growth is very small, except, of course, for the Democratic Alliance, who in the 2011 local government elections increased the number of local councils that it supported and increased the percentage share of the vote that it received. But this was amongst its traditional voters. Amongst black African voters, there is evidence which suggests that they only increased their support by 2.5%. Now, if you're asking me whether opposition parties will start mushrooming, gaining strength because of the global economic crisis and the inability of the governing ANC to be able to respond appropriately, no. That is because the growth in opposition is happening differently. It's happening on the streets, and it's happening through social movements, through there's been the emergence of the Occupy movements. And of course last week in Cape Town, there a bunch of citizens and people got together and tried to occupy Rondebosch Common. And that's the kind of opposition that we're looking at emerging, which is responding to what is a global crisis of capitalism. And even The Economist is now admitting that there is this crisis, and we have to rethink the way in which it works. So no, I'm afraid opposition parties aren't growing because of the global economic crisis. They would grow because they need to be endemically rooted in the societies themselves. And many of our parties outside the DA don't show very strong roots in society and don't show much potential for growth. In fact, many of them declined in the 2011 local government elections and in the 2009 national elections. They performed worse than they did previously, except for the DA. But their performance, their increase in performance has also not been tremendous. So the opposition to the ANC is happening in the ANC firstly, which is a good thing because it provides some kind of constraining oversight within the governing alliance. But it's also happening through citizens' movements and through ordinary citizens taking to the streets, whether they be ad hoc and sporadic protests or whether they've been trying to sort of find some kind of organizational form in the Occupy movements or other social movements which exist.
Well, thank you very much for your insight, Ebrahim.